Welcome to Lights and Buttons. Today we'll be talking about painting a stripe on wheels. We'll be going from this to this. Today we'll be painting my wheels. I'm planning to add a thin blue stripe along the inner edge of the wheel. And this is the NK-SS05 20-inch wheels that I use during my non-winter months. And then what I'm planning to do is not to paint the whole wheel. As I said, we'll be adding a thin stripe. And then also, since it's my first time painting any wheel, I'm planning to use Plasti Dip. And if you're not familiar what Plasti Dip is, it's pretty much a spray paint that goes on as a liquid and then it'll dry as rubber. So this rubbery substance can be peeled off if you don't like it, if you mess up somehow. The problem is that if you put too thin of a coat on, it gets a little bit difficult to remove. You might need to use some glue gun or something, or you might need to rub it off. But in general, if you apply it on properly and you don't like the look, you just peel it out. No need to sand. You do need to do some prep work though, make sure the surface is clean, as well as having the area masked off. So in my case, since I'm not painting the whole wheel, I'll be doing a lot of masking off and using a lot of painter's tape. I'm doing this before removing my winter tires, so I figured it's the perfect time to paint. And I'll show you some of the techniques I'm using, as well as some of the mistakes I made as a first-time painter. So let's jump into the project. To do this project, you need some masking paper for the inside of the wheels. I also got a comfort grip that adds a trigger to the spray paint. This makes it much easier to paint, and it only costs a few bucks. I also got a tarp, which can protect the floor, and yes, I learned the hard way, so make sure you do this before you paint. As for the Plasti Dip itself, I opted in for the blaze blue color. I'd say one can probably do all four wheels if everything goes perfectly the first time, but you may need to do 2 cans, and that's what I recommend in case if you're taking off some tape and it accidentally gouges into the paint. It doesn't hurt to keep an extra can for the future. I used 3 since I was experimenting with different techniques, and I redid it a bunch of times. Glue gun is also useful for melting away unwanted Plasti Dip. I also got painter's tape since that's obviously important for the edges. I actually found out that the no-name brand from Harbor Freight works a little bit better since it's not as sticky. The Scotch brand here works well, but maybe a little bit too well, where I have to use extra strength to pull it, and sometimes it pulls other tape along with it. I also have a spray bottle with some isopropyl alcohol for extra cleaning. And finally, not pictured here, I have a fan to keep the air moving while I'm spray painting. If you want to skip through all the experimenting and go to the technique that works for me, feel free to skip ahead in this video. As with any painting project, preparation is key, and that's the part that takes up the most time. I first cleaned the wheels because you don't want to have any dirt, grime, brake dust interfere with the painting process. Next, I started to mask the wheel, so this is where the painter's tape come in, and in my opinion, it's harder to paint a thin line rather than the whole wheel because you're pretty much masking out all the different areas to not paint rather than putting note cards around the edge of the wheel and painting everything else. And by doing this, you discover just how many angles your wheels have when you tape off all the edges. And also, I taped up the valve stem to protect it. Before I continue, in my first attempt, I made 4 different mistakes. First off, I didn't cover the floor, so make sure you protect your floor from any overspray. Second, I didn't keep track how much I was spray painting, so some of the wheels were darker than others. Next up, when I first spray painted, I didn't use a grip. And this is, again, one of those things that just costs a few bucks and it works wonders. It's less strain on your hand and gives you more control. And finally, I followed generic painting instructions for Plasti Dip over the web, and that didn't really apply here, and you'll see why in a little bit. First, I shook the can for a good minute or 2. Then I started to do my first coat, allowing for 50% coverage. I let it dry for a half hour, and at this point you don't see any overspray, but trust me, later on you will. So again, make sure you're covering the whole area you're spraying in. Next, I moved on to the second coat, and this time I added a thicker layer so that the remaining 50% is filled in. But this was way too thin, and I didn't realize it until later on. I waited another 30 minutes, then I painted the third coat. Immediately after the last wheel was painted, I started to pull off the tape, hoping that I'll get the tape off before the paint dries, but unfortunately it was too late, and the paint started to tear away from the wheel. It just seemed that there was no time for me to take off the tape to get a clean edge. So we got overspray, we got ripped Plasti Dip, but I still gave this another try. So Some parts were thick enough where I can peel off like Plasti Dip was intended to. Others were too thin, as I mentioned, and I had to either A, rub them off, or B, use Goo Gone to get them off. Well, here's another day of fun. I have a blue tarp that I bought, and I'm going to be a little bit smarter this time and not have overspray hit the garage floor. But in addition to that, we're going to do some things differently. We're going to try one wheel at a time rather than putting all my eggs in one basket. And then for the Plasti Dip that can't be peeled off easily because the coat is too thin, I'm going to use Goo Gone. And surprisingly, this stuff will actually melt off the existing Plasti Dip, and you can do that pretty easily by soaking it and then rubbing it off. Another thing that I'll be using is the comfort grip. This allows you to add a trigger to an aerosol can, and this will make it hopefully easier to spray on the coat and make it a little bit more even. And then, so for less than $5, I said, hey, why not? Let's give it a try. So fingers crossed this will work. As you can see, the Goo Gone melts away the unwanted Plasti Dip, which helps with cleanup. Since you saw me masking the wheels for the first time, I'll skip over that. For attempt number 2, I decided to use the aerosol trigger grip. I first shook the can without the trigger grip, then I added it on, clipping it to the top. For safety, aim the can away from your face while doing this, and probably away from the camera too. While using this, I felt more controlled, but I'm still not painting every wheel as evenly as I'd like. Like the first attempt, I added on a thin first coat, then I waited a half hour, and then added a second coat, waited another half hour, then added coat number 3. For coat number 3, I added a thicker layer to try to keep the paint wet, but when I removed the painter's tape, the paint still dried too quickly, and the Plasti Dip still tore off the wheel without a clean cut. Man, at this point, I was ready to quit. But I thought, what if the problem is that the surface area was too small, and the thickness was not really as much as what the professional spray guns put down, and maybe the techniques that I found from my research doesn't make sense because they're painting a much larger surface area. While that aerosol trigger gave me more control and made it easier on the hand, which was great, I decided to improve my technique. I tried a few more times on the smaller areas and got mixed results. But before I got to repainting all the wheels for the last main attempt, which was probably the 4th or 5th time going through all the wheels, I got a new delivery. The original tires that I had installed on these wheels were the Michelin Pilot Super Sports 245/35s, and they only lasted 11,000 miles before the tread got low and I had to replace the tires. Now, I've heard in some forums that some people got 8,000 miles out of them and then had to replace them, so I guess 11 is not that bad. For me, I wish the tires lasted a little bit longer, at least maybe 20,000 miles, but maybe I'm just being wishful. But anyway, I decided to go with all-season tires because during the winter to spring transition, if the temperature drops below 50 degrees or 40 degrees, then I don't have to worry about the temperature as much. Having all season tires. Also, they're a little bit cheaper and hopefully last longer, so I decided to go with the Continental Extreme Contact DWS 06, also 245/35, so that would be mounted on by a tire shop. What was the technique that works best in my case? Spray 2 heavier coats, each with 15 passes, and waiting 10 to 15 seconds between each coat. Now when you're spraying, make sure you don't spray too heavy where it runs, and in my case, when I did the 15 passes, the paint did not run at all. By counting the number of passes per coat, it keeps the color more even, assuming my painting speed is consistent. As a test, I decided to try it on only 2 sections, and note that the edges are rounded, so sometimes determining where to tape off can be a little bit tricky. And I think next time, maybe a better thing to do, since the edges are rounded, put the tape up a little bit higher so that you get more paint and a little bit less silver showing. And when the tape comes off, voila! Clean edges, no tears. On the right is the wet paint, and on the left is the dried paint. So that's drying. This one, along with the 2 in the back, they have some imperfections in the paint, so I'm going to try to redo those. Ideally, I get them done before taking it to the shop, but I do have an appointment to mount these on tomorrow. So we'll put these on and then continue the painting. After the tires are mounted and balanced, I continued painting. I gotta say, this is much better than before. Now that I got the painting process down, I'm going to repeat this for the rest of the wheels. After painting each wheel, I'm taking off the tape as soon as possible, but also doing it carefully so that the other tape doesn't get pulled off and potentially rubbed into the wet paint. To test the durability, I fired up the 1500 psi power washer and none of the Plasti Dip came off, so it's holding up pretty well. Here are some other tips and tricks I've learned in this project. First, spraying about 6 inches away seemed to work for me. Because I'm spraying a thin line, I'm inclined to spray a little bit closer, but not too close. If you have bright wheels, you can get away with not using primer. Be careful taking off the tape. As I mentioned before, you don't want to pull up tape that pulls other tape and in turn gouge into a good wet section of the paint and making you needing to redo that section of the wheel. Even though I generally like the results, doing 2 coats with 15 passes each was good, but I think I'd like to see a little bit darker blue or a little bit more of a bolder blue at the end. So I would even consider adding more passes to each coat if I were to do this again. Don't clean up the overspray if you see any until the paint dries, because if you're rubbing off the Plasti Dip, it can actually fall into the good wet paint and ruin your paint job. Don't ask me how I found out. I can't stress enough how useful that aerosol trigger is, so I highly recommend it. It's only a few bucks and you won't regret buying it. Don't attempt to touch up torn paint. So if you're pulling off tape and a little bit of paint gets nicked off because it dried too quickly, don't try to respray over it because the paint is transparent and the way the paint builds up on top of the existing paint, you won't have an even color. So I'd say just save yourself the trouble and repaint that section. Along the beginning and end of each pass, your wheel may curve up a little bit. It may not be like a 90-degree stop, so change the angle of your spray paint so that it hits it directly for a more even finish. And finally, if you're using a fan to vent the area, don't put the fan too close because even on a low setting, at least with the fan that I have, it can still be too much and blow the spray paint all around. Man, I'm glad that time, energy, and effort was put into good use and finally paid off at the end, because this thing probably took 2, 3, maybe I'd say 3 to 4 weeks in total. Mostly on the weekends. I found that during the weekdays it kind of got dark too soon. But I was kind of nervous because I might have to back out of it and kind of undo all the effort that I put into it. So if you guys are also doing your own Plasti Dip project, I'd like to hear about it. Do you follow the same process that I'm doing for these wheel stripes? So let me know in the comments below. Also, I'll be posting up the final product video as a separate video that I'll link to. And thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.